السلام عليكم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له. وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. I really liked the theme of this camp because it was talking about looking at the deeper meaning of these rituals that we typically as Muslims engage in. We know as believers, we're told that there are 5 pillars, and we've been taught this since we were young. We know that the first pillar is the shahada, to bear witness that there is nothing worthy of our worship but God, and that Muhammad ﷺ is his final messenger. We know that the second pillar of Islam is about salah, and we know about zakat, and we know about siyam, about fasting, we know about hajj. But the problem, I think, is that we take these rituals and unfortunately we don't see the deeper meaning in the rituals. Sometimes we are fasting, but we don't understand the purpose of the fasting. We're praying, but we don't understand why we're praying. We believe in certain things, but we don't really understand them. And they don't really have a bearing on our everyday life. And that's a problem. What that does is it makes us, what I would say, sort of miss the point. And this is what I would call missing the essence of Islam. When we miss the essence of Islam, when we miss the point, this is when we get into arguments about things like moon sighting. This is when we get into arguments about things like dhabiha/zabiha meat. And this is when we miss the actual core, the purpose, and we start to focus on the details. The reason why we fall into that is because we have missed the essence of La ilaha illallah. We've missed the essence of our purpose, essentially. So to begin to talk about the essence of Islam, we have to talk about Tawheed. The reason we have to talk about Tawheed is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the purpose of our creation. Allah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah tells us that He tells us, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ, I have not created jinn and human beings except for one purpose. This ayah is important for us to understand the structure. I could say this in a number of different ways. You can structure a sentence in a number of different ways. You can make a statement in a number of different ways. I can say that the purpose, for example, if I want to say the purpose of why I'm here at this conference, I could say to you, the reason I'm here is, the purpose of my being here in Champaign-Urbana is to give you a lecture and to meet this so-and-so person and to, take a trip to Chicago and, visit Devon. Okay? and go to, Italian Express. I could say that. So by saying that I've said now that the reason I'm here is to give a lecture. When I say it in that way, I can have more than one purpose. The reason I'm here is to give a lecture, but it's also to meet Sarah, and it's also to go to Devon. But if I were to say instead that I didn't come here for any other purpose except to give a lecture, now there's no Devon, there's no Sarah. I only came for one purpose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say, I created jinn and human beings to worship me. This is not how the ayah is structured. Instead, Allah says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. The ayah begins with a negation. We have not created jinn and human beings for any other purpose, in parentheses. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ. We have not created jinn and human beings إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So first, Allah negates any other purpose before He tells us the one and only purpose. That means that it's very important for us to understand the meaning of ubudiyyah. Because Allah, our Creator, has told us this is the only reason you were created. So how can we not understand that? It's like if somebody designs a blender there's only one reason that that blender was made, right? If that blender doesn't understand why it was made, or the blender isn't blending things, then it hasn't fulfilled its purpose. And what's the point of it existing? If the blender instead rebels, if it had the choice, and says, actually, I don't want to blend, I want to drive people to, the mall. It's not going to work because you weren't created for the purpose that a car was created for. You were created for a specific, to fulfill a specific purpose. And you as a creation have to fulfill that purpose, or else there's no point in you even existing. We need to understand the meaning of ubudiyya because Allah has told us this answer which many people go through their lives never knowing. How many people get lost in this question? Why am I here? Like, what's my purpose? What am I doing here? People ask this question if they're awake. But many people get lost because they don't know the answer to this question. You and I are very privileged to know the answer to that question. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator and the creator of everything, told us the answer. It is ubudiyya. Illa liya'budun. So now the question is, what is that? What is that? What is ubudiyya? What does it mean? Illa liya'budun. Another way to translate this part of the ayah is to say that we have not created jinn and human beings except to be a abd to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now we still have one more word that we have to translate. Abd. I am an abd. The purpose of my creation is to be a abd, is to embrace that, to be that willingly and lovingly. Abd. So what's a abd? If I ask you what is the meaning of this word abd, most people will raise their hand and say it means slave, right? That's typically how this word is translated. But when you think of a slave, what's the concept that comes to your mind? What do you think about? Yes?
Like cuffs.
Cuffs?
I said unwillingness.
Unwillingness. Basically, usually when we think of the word slave, we think of oppression. We think of the opposite of freedom, right? Now this is what's very interesting about ubudiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you are a abd to Allah, you're actually free. So when you enslave yourself to Allah, you are actually the free person. So a more befitting translation of the word abd is the free person. Because what you have done, as the companion said, there was a companion, peace be upon him, when he came to give the message of Islam, he said a very profound statement. He said, I have come to free you from the servitude to the slave and bring you to the servitude of the Lord of the slave. So it's actually freedom. You're no longer enslaved by the creation because you are a abd to the Creator. Now you're not restricted by the definitions of society. You're not restricted by what the creation is doing or not doing, giving or withholding, because now you're free of all that. Your center of gravity becomes God and not the creation. Now that brings us to the very first pillar of Islam. When a person wants to become Muslim, what do? It's a very simple process to enter into Islam. What does that process involve? Saying, yes, what do you say? The Shahada. Can someone say the Shahada for me in Arabic? Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Simple, right? Now the way, again, this statement is translated is also often very wrong. Most of the time, or some of the time, this statement is translated as, I bear witness that there's no God but Allah. I bear witness that there's no God but Allah. There is a problem in this translation. I think it can be misleading. The reason is when you hear this statement, or if a non-Muslim hears this statement, what is understood by the statement is, well, kind of almost as if we're saying, well, I have my God, you have your God, but Allah is like the only real God. That's not what this statement is saying. This statement is saying, La ilaha illallah. This statement is saying there is no ilah except God. Allah, the word Allah, is not a Muslim God. The word Allah just means God in Arabic. Therefore, Christian Arabs also call him Allah. Christian Arabs also say Insha'Allah. Because Allah is the Arabic word for God. Therefore, when we translate La ilaha illallah, what we are saying is there is no ilah except God. God here meaning the God of all people, all time, that one supreme God of all religions, not a separate Muslim God. That brings us to the essential question of what is the meaning of this word ilah. I have now translated in that section everything except that word. La ilaha illallah. There is no ilah except God. Now my question to you, what is an ilah? And this is the heart of Tawheed, and this is the essence of Islam. What is the meaning of the word ilah? Does anyone want to throw out a definition?
Oneness.
Okay. Anyone else?
One word. One worthy of worship.
Worthy of worship. That's the closest, probably, if you had to use just a couple words to translate it, that's probably the closest. But I want to explain to you beyond that, because when you think of the word worship, and this brings us back to the concept of ubudiyyah, what do you think of when I say the word worship? How would you define worship? Typically, when you think of the word worship, you think of somebody maybe praying, somebody fasting, somebody sitting in some sort of place of worship, bowing their head. That's the concept of worship. And all of that is true. That is worship. But our problem is we limit worship to those things. Let me throw something at you and ask you this question. There is a verse in the Quran that says, do you see those who take their own vain desires, their hawa, as their ilah? Do you see the one who takes his own hawa, his own desires or inclinations, as his ilah? So my question to you is, does anybody bow down to can you physically bow down to your desires? Can you make dua to your desires? Can you do tawaf around your desires? So what is it talking about? How can you take your desires as an ilah? How can you worship your desires if worship just means praying? What's the answer? It means that the concept of worship has to be bigger than just bowing in prayer, than just making dua, than just the rituals. The concept of worship has to be much bigger and much deeper. To get at the concept of worship, now we can talk about the meaning of ilah. What do you guys think a person who takes their desires as their ilah, what would that look like? What does that mean? To you, what does that mean?
Put your hawa first. Put your hawa first.
Putting your hawa first. Okay. Yes.
Submission.
Submission. Good. What else? Other words. How about obedience? Putting it first, submission, obedience, revolving your life around it, doing whatever it commands you to do. So, now is it kind of making sense? When your hawa is your Lord, that means that anything that feels good, anything that my inclinations drive me to, becomes okay. Because my Lord is my inclination. My Lord is my desire. Now all of a sudden, the arguments that we have, for example, this discussion about homosexuality, this is the core of the issue. When we talk about something like homosexuality, the discussion should not be about whether or not someone is born with this inclination, because that's not the point. We are all born with tons of inclinations. We are all born with something called hawa. It's not a surprise. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about hawa in the Quran. Hawa is our inclinations, our desires, which may or may not be in line with the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is there anyone in the world who didn't have a desire that went against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded? If they did, then they were not human, they were angels. Because part of the struggle, part of the fact that we have free will, that we have free choice, is that there will be things that we want to do that we aren't supposed to do. When you're angry, you want to punch the person in front of you in the face, right? You may want to do that. That may be your inclination. Does it make it okay to do it? If you're married, it doesn't mean that you're not going to find anyone else attractive but your wife. If you're married and you find someone, opposite gender and all, someone you're not married to attractive, does that now mean it's okay to commit adultery? Do you understand the point? Just because you feel something, just because your inclinations drive you towards one way or another, doesn't make it moral. Just because I feel it doesn't make it right. In fact, all of us have to struggle against our hawa. And everyone has their own struggle. That's the point. That's the point. And so somehow in this discussion, among other, this is kind of a hot topic right now, but somehow in that discussion we miss the point. The point isn't whether or not I'm born with this inclination. The point isn't whether or not I want or I don't want, or I'm attracted or I'm not attracted. Because our criteria of right and wrong is not my desires. Isn't just because I feel like it, I can do it. Because, there are some people who are born and they might be more aggressive. Naturally, more aggressive. So when they get upset, they want to beat up the person they're upset with. Or they want, they have maybe more aggressive tendencies. Does that all of a sudden mean it's okay for that person to go around and to be violent? Because they have that inclination? Again, back to the example. When a person gets married, and this is something all religions agree to. Most religions, or anybody who follows, will say that adultery is wrong, right? This is this is like, the 10 Commandments. This is an understood thing. But what if we use the same argument? Then we would say, well, actually, adultery is okay because I was attracted to her. Is that an argument? Is that an argument? Yeah, you can't commit adultery just because you're attracted. Of course you're attracted to, that's normal. Even if the attraction is natural, it doesn't make the act okay. So what happens when, you have an inclination which is not, natural or is not typical, it still doesn't mean all of a sudden that the act is okay. So again, it comes back to the concept of worship, as in what is my criteria of how I live my life? What is my criteria of what I put first? Is it my desires or is it God? So is it what pleases me and my lower self, or is it God? And if it is what pleases me, if that is what I put first, this is the essence of worship. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to when He says, do you see the one who takes his own desires as his Lord, as his ilah? The concept of submission, the concept of Islam. What does this word mean? Islam. What does it mean to be a Muslim? What does the actual word mean?
Surrender.
Surrender, submit. So a Muslim, by definition, is someone who submits or surrenders. Now, here's my question to you. Everybody in the world, everybody submits or surrenders to something. Everyone does. Don't think that you're not a slave. We're all slaves. We are all slaves. The question is just, am I a slave to the Creator or am I a slave to the creation? That's the only question. It isn't whether or not I'm a slave. I am a slave by definition. We all submit to something. We all obey something. But the question that we have to ask, each and every one of us have to ask ourselves is, what am I a slave to? And there are a lot of people who are slaves to money, for example. What does it mean to be a slave to money? Well, I'll do anything to get it. I'll do anything to defend it. I will give my life. I will take life. I will steal. I will lie. I'll do anything to get it. Is that not worship? That's the essence of worship. That you'll do anything for it. You'll sacrifice anything for it. You'll kill, you'll steal, you'll lie. That is worship. Some people, they worship status. Some people, they worship their careers. Some people worship other people. Have you ever heard of someone who got dumped and went crazy and went killing someone? Has that ever happened? Did they kill them? They killed themselves, or they killed the other person, or they killed the other person's boyfriend or girlfriend. Has this not happened? Why? Why the story of Romeo and Juliet? What's that even about? Is that about love? That's about worship. That is about worship. Because what happens is, if you take something as an ilah, it means that now you've taken that thing and you've put it at the center of your universe. Everything you do becomes for the sake of that thing. And you will be willing to give up anything for that thing. That's why I said some people worship money. That's why I said some people worship their careers. They will give up everything for the sake of their careers. Some it's status. They will give up anything and everything for the sake of their image and their status. And for some it's other people. And this is the dangerous thing, is that it's easy for me to tell you don't be materialistic, and you can understand that concept. It's easy, right? Don't be attached to material things. But if I tell you don't be attached to other people, it's a little harder to understand, right? What do you mean don't be attached to other people? I'm supposed to love my family, and I'm supposed to love my children, I'm supposed to love my spouse. So this is where it becomes tricky. Here, when we talk about ultimate attachments, we are talking about an ilah. We are talking about taking something other than God and putting it at the center of your existence. Islam is about doing the opposite. Islam is about taking everything else that we put at the center and putting God there instead. That is what La ilaha illallah means. It means that there is nothing else that is worthy of being at the center. There is nothing else that is worthy of dictating how I live my life, what I'm willing to do, what I'm willing to sacrifice for, except for God. There's nothing else that I'm a slave to. There's nothing else that I obey ultimately. There's nothing else that I love more. There's nothing else that I fear more. There's nothing else that I depend on more. That is what Tawheed is. That is what La ilaha illallah means. So many times we miss this. We miss this because we say that we're Muslim. And in fact, as practicing Muslims, we say the Shahada so many times a day. Every time you pray, you say the Shahada numerous times. La ilaha illallah. Yeah, we say it. But are we living it? My question to you is, are we actually living it? There are some very practical ways to see, to ascertain whether or not we are living La ilaha illallah. And of course there's a range, right? Tawheed, there's a range of how much Tawheed we have in our hearts. But to get an idea, just ask yourself a couple simple questions. Okay, one of them is, what do you think about all day? What are you always preoccupied by? What occupies your mind all day long, including during salah, during your prayers? What are you thinking about when you pray? All the time, all the time. What are you thinking about, when you're trying to fall asleep? What are you thinking about right when you wake up? The reason why this is so important is because there is a direct relationship between what is in our hearts and what is on our minds. As there is a relationship between what is on our minds and what is in our hearts. It's a closed loop. The more you think about something, the more you love it. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to remember Him a lot. Remember Him a lot. Dhikr is not intended to be once in a while, once a week on Friday, twice a year on Eid. Dhikr, remembrance of God is supposed to be a lot. Allah says it should be a lot. It's not just 5 times a day, but it's in between. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes a people in Surah Al-Imran, and He says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. And in the alteration between night and day, لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, are signs for those who have albab. Ulil albab, literally ulil albab means those who have an inside, who have a heart, it's like the innermost part of a human being. It's someone who isn't hollow, someone who has that internal part. لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Only those people who have an inside are going to see the signs in the heavens and earth. And the ayats go on to say, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. Those who remember God standing and sitting and on their sides. You notice this? Allah doesn't say they remember Him once in a while, when they're listening to a lecture, or when it's Eid, or during Ramadan, and then not for the rest of the year. Standing and sitting and on their sides. Not only when they're in trouble, not only when they need something, when they want to get married or whatever, or want to have, they get a new house and then they read Quran for a while. The idea here is it's standing, sitting, and on their sides. It's all the time. It's in every position of your life. It's in every circumstance. It's in every situation. This is the example of the Prophet ﷺ. That's how he lived. So he was involved obviously in life. You guys go to school. You guys are going to get married. You guys are going to have kids. You're going to do all that. You don't go and you don't hide out in i'tikaf in the masjid and not be involved in everything. The Prophet ﷺ played all of those roles. He was a father. He was a husband. He was a son. He was a leader. He was all of these things. He was a friend. But in all of those roles, he saw Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In all of those roles, he was remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when you do that, those roles become an act of worship. This is why Allah said, we started out with the ayah, that Allah tells us our one and only purpose, right? If ubudiyyah is our one and only purpose, then doesn't it follow that you have to be able to do it at it has to have the potential to be done at every moment. If that's my purpose, if that's my only purpose, rather, then it can't be something that I can only do once a week. Because that would mean that I'm only fulfilling my purpose on Friday prayer and I'm not fulfilling my purpose the rest of the week. Or I'm only fulfilling my purpose of creation during Ramadan and then I'm not fulfilling my purpose the rest of the time. There has to be the capacity to be doing it at every moment of my existence, even while I'm sleeping. Even while I'm sleeping. My sleep can be an act of worship. My sleep can be an act of worship. How can my sleep be an act of worship? It is by your intention. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. That actions are by intention. Your intention can transform the school that the schooling, the education that you're getting, the work that you're doing, from just, learning some information, applying it here and there, to actually an act of worship. If you have the right intention and if it is done in the right way. That's how you transform every role that you have to an act of worship. So dhikr, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those are the people who are able to see the signs in the heavens and the earth. Those who remember Allah standing and sitting on their sides. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ. And they reflect on the creation of the heavens and the earth, and they say, "Oh my Lord, you have not created all of this without a purpose. And you are high above, subhanak, Allah is high above doing anything without a purpose. فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ." So you see that the sort of the mental progression, the spiritual journey of a person who has an insight, who's awake, who's paying attention, who's searching, is this. They remember God and they look around them. Look around them at the signs everywhere. And the signs are, as Allah tells us, they are outside of ourselves and they are inside of ourselves. What we go through in life, there are signs in it. What we feel, there are signs. What we experience, what we see, what is created, everywhere around us is a sign. But some people are just asleep. They're not paying attention. When you are paying attention, you realize this. رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ. My Lord, you have not created all of this without a purpose. Have you guys ever been through a hardship in your life? If you're alive for more than 2 seconds, you've been through a hardship in your life. Because even when you're first born, you're going through hardship. You are going through hardship. You're cold, you're hungry, you're struggling to breathe. Right when you enter this world, you struggle. From day one, you struggle. Have you ever wondered what's the purpose? Have you ever wondered what's the purpose? Why am I struggling? Why do things have to be so hard? Those people who have that understanding, they say, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ. Those people realize that Allah doesn't do anything without a purpose. You have not created all of this without a purpose. Allah doesn't give you hardships without a purpose. Allah doesn't do anything without a purpose. You have to be conscious and seek that purpose. And know, and this is so important, the reason a lot of us go off track is when we are hit with a hardship, or when things are difficult, or when we have to struggle, we just get upset. We get upset and we say, why me? Or how could you do this to me? These kinds of attitudes towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person who reacts in that way doesn't really understand the big picture. It's like a child who goes to a doctor, and the doctor says, you know, this child is sick, and to cure this child, I have to give this child a shot. To strengthen this child, I have to give this child a vaccine. And the child doesn't see anything but the shot. The child doesn't see anything but the needle, and gets angry at the doctor. Now the child wants to rebel against the doctor. Because why? Because the doctor hurt the child. There's a prick to the needle, right? And so the child now wants to rebel. A lot of us are just like that child. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us things in our life that hurt us, or things that we have to struggle against, we just see the pain and we don't see the cure, and we get angry at the doctor. And Allah is high above any analogy. But we get angry at God and we say, how could you do this to me? It's like the child who says, how could you do this to me? How could you give me a shot? But what happens to a person when they get more mature and they understand the purpose of the shot? You know, when you don't want to beat up the doctor anymore, right? Once you're an adult, you go to the doctor and you leave the doctor and you're actually thanking the doctor for giving you the shot, right? You say thank you because you know that that shot is curing you. But you can only react in that way when you have the proper maturity. There's also something called spiritual maturity, where you understand that this hardship or this struggle or this situation or this experience is actually for a greater good. It is actually for a higher cause. And when you see that, then you no longer are angry with the doctor. And in fact, you can respond with something called either sabr. What is sabr? Sabr is patience. Sabr is perseverance. Sabr is constancy. Sabr in this example is refraining from complaint against Allah. It's refraining from complaint against God. When you have the struggle, when you have the hardship, but you don't complain against God. Let me ask you this. Is there a difference between complaining against God and complaining to God? And if so, what's the difference? Well, I'll tell you this. We know from the Quran and from the Hadith that even prophets, peace be upon them, complained to God. They complained to God. The father of Yusuf ﷺ says, I only complain to God of my pain, of my sorrow. Muhammad ﷺ after Ta'if, the beautiful, beautiful, profound dua, he says, I complain to you. This is going to Allah and seeking help. This is going to Allah and admitting our own need for Him and our own weakness. And that's very different than saying, oh God, how could you do this to me? That's very different than being angry at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To give you an example of this, and Allah is high above any analogy. Imagine a situation where you are upset with your friend. You are upset with your friend, and you go to your friend and you say, you did this to me, this to me, this to me, and I'm angry and I'm upset with you. That scenario is very different than you are just upset. And you go to your friend and you say, I need your help. I'm really upset. I'm really struggling. I'm really having a lot of trouble. You see the difference in the two scenarios? In one scenario, you are blaming the friend. You are complaining about her or him. Versus you are going to the friend for help and support and admitting your own weaknesses. So you're actually complaining about yourself. The difference is, in one scenario, you're complaining about God, and the other scenario, you're complaining about yourself and your own inability to handle things, because we are all created weak by our nature. Is it a problem that we're created weak? Well, that's an interesting question. Allah created us weak. Allah created us imperfect. And Allah, we said, doesn't do anything without a purpose. Allah does not make mistakes. Why do you think that Allah made us imperfect? Why do you think that when we're faced with a hardship, we cannot handle it ourselves? What's the purpose of that? What could be the purpose of that?
So we turn to God?
Exactly. Exactly. You send a storm and there's only one refuge. There's only one refuge. But if I thought that I was depending on myself, then I've missed the point of the storm. Does that make sense? You know, a lot of times we talk in Islam about everything is a test, right? We've been told since we're little, it's a test, it's a test, it's a test. Like if you don't know anything else about Islam, you know that it's all a test, right? Like this is just what we've been taught. But I think that we don't really understand the concept of a test. Because we're thinking that Allah is like a professor, a'udhu billah, and He hands out the tests, and then He stands back to see how you're going to do. And when you're in an exam, you all know about this, if you're in an exam, are you allowed to raise your hand and say, oh, professor, hey, can you help me with this question over here? I'm really struggling with this problem, can you help me? Are you allowed to do that? No, because that's called cheating. Alright? You can't do that. So we deal with Allah in that same way. We deal with Allah in that same way. When we're facing a hardship or a test, we think, oh man, I gotta deal with this myself. I gotta take care of this myself. I can't ask for help. I can't ask for help. I gotta do this. And then we think, oh, okay, I got this. I got this. I'm good. I don't need help. And we start to depend on ourselves. And we say, no, I'm going to be strong. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to show Allah I got this. That's not the point. It is not the point. You're not trying to impress Allah with the fact that you got this. The point is for you to raise your hand and ask for help. The point is for you to turn to Allah. You get it? It's not like Allah needs to give you a test just to stand back and see how you're going to do. Allah says again and again and again in the Quran that the purpose of the hardship, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ, so that they will come back to us. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَضَّرَّعُونَ, so that they will have a state or be in a state of tadarra'. Tadarra' is that state of utter humility and need for God, which unfortunately we don't normally feel unless we're in a hardship. Unfortunately, we as human beings, we get very caught up when things are easy. When things, it's like when you're on the beach and you're, sipping like, of course, virgin pina colada. You're not really thinking about your need for God. You're not really conscious of it because you feel safe. And you're very reliant on your own self. And you think, it's like, there's no storm. I'm safe. I'm fine. I got my money. I got my car. I got my house. I'm good. And we have all these false senses of security. I got my security system. I'm good, right? But it's only when the storm hits, typically, that we realize, oh boy, okay, I don't got my money anymore. Now I don't have my car anymore. And it's when you don't have your money, and you don't have your car, and you don't have your house, and you don't have all these other things that you were leaning on before. Now what do? Even the atheists will do this. Even the atheists, you put them in the middle of the ocean, and the storm hits, believe me, they're going to look for a higher power. Because it's inside of us. But it's so covered up by all our false dependencies. It's so covered up by all of our false ilahs, all of our false idols. The things that we take and we make into an ilah. But when you're in that situation, then what do? Everybody would do it. You turn, it doesn't matter who you are. When you have nothing else to depend on of the false dependencies, that's when you turn to God. So now we understand what is the purpose of the hardship. What is the purpose of the hardship? It's to make us do that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His mercy wants to bring us back to Him. But like I said, when we're on the beach and it's comfortable and we're drinking, some nice cold drink, we're not turning back to Him. Unfortunately, we as human beings, we get distracted. And we get very deceived by our false dependencies, by our money, by our success, by our status, by the people in our lives. And it's when we lose those things, or we fear losing those things, that we start to wake up. If you want to know how to be successful in a hardship, make it bring you back to God. If it brings you back to Him and it makes you depend on Him and not on yourself, and not on other people, and not on your money, and not on your house, and not on your car, then that is the purpose of the hardship itself. Because you have been brought back. And Allah says that He gives us these things. One of the reasons He gives us these things, لِيُمَحِّصَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, in order for Allah to purify those who believe. It is a purification because it makes us come back to Him and it makes us depend on Him alone. This is again bringing us back to La ilaha illallah. That is the essence of Islam. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم سبحانك الله وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. I want to leave time for questions, and I also want to add something with regards to, we started out by talking about the 5 pillars, something we all know, something we all grew up with. But I want to show you about the 5 pillars from a different angle in the context of what we just talked about. When you study the 5 pillars in the context of what we just talked about, you will find that every single one of those 5 pillars are all helping you in this same journey of leaving the false dependencies, of leaving the false ilahs, of leaving the false idols and coming to the only one worthy of being an ilah. shahada. You said La ilaha illallah. That firm belief in action and in speech and in heart that there's nothing worthy of being an ilah but Allah, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger. Salah. What's that about? Salah. What do you do 5 times a day? Well, what you do 5 times a day, if you're following the prescription as given to you by the doctor, the ultimate doctor, you will be moving away, disengaging from whatever it is that you're doing in your life and refocusing on your ultimate purpose. That's what salah is. You could be watching a basketball game, playing a basketball game, at the mall, in class, taking an exam, whatever it is that you're doing at the time of Fajr, whatever it is you're doing at the time of Dhuhr, whatever it is you're doing at the time of Asr, Maghrib, or Isha, you leave it and you go and you pray. What is that doing? What is that training us to do? It is training us to refocus on our purpose and to not get too engrossed or too attached to whatever of the dunya you were doing. Because you really can't. And notice that the 5 prayers are not all at once, right before you sleep, although some of us unfortunately think that they are. The 5 prayers are spread out throughout your day. Why do you need to get up at a time when you're typically sleeping and pray? Why couldn't it just be whenever you wake up? Because what you're saying is, Allahu Akbar. You're saying God is greater than my sleep. You're saying God is greater. When you're giving money, from your wealth, zakat, you are saying Allahu Akbar. You're saying Allah is greater than being attached to this money. And by giving a portion of it, you're curing yourself from being too attached to the money. With salah, you're curing yourself of being too attached to whatever it is that you're doing. The video game that you're playing, the game that you're watching, the sale that you're engrossed in, the class, the exam, you could be in an argument, whatever it is, you're saying that Allah is greater. And you leave that and you go pray. So it's keeping you from being too attached to those things. Money, same thing, zakat. What about fasting? What does that do? What is that doing? Well, that's keeping you from being too attached to the demands and desires of your body. Because our body have natural demands and desires to eat and to drink and for intimacy. You are actually pulling yourself away for a portion of time from those desires in order to not be too attached to them. So that you're not worshiping those things. You're not worshiping the desire, the lower desire to eat, the lower desire to sleep, to drink, the lower desire for intimacy. Instead of those desires commanding you, you are commanding them. Instead of those desires controlling you, you are controlling them. Because you're saying, no, I'm not going to eat right now. No, I'm not going to drink right now. No, I'm not going to, even with your own spouse, I'm not going to have intimacy right now. You are becoming, so what's happening is you're taking the steering wheel. Because a lot of us, dude, like those desires have the steering wheel. Right? Right? Yes or no? Yeah, those desires take the steering wheel. That means I don't care who you are, whether or not it's moral. If I want, if I want intimacy, I'm just going to take it. So the drive itself takes the steering wheel. And when we live that way, we become no different than the animals. The reason is that an animal feels hunger just like us, an animal feels thirst just like us, and an animal feels the desire for intimacy or, just like us, right? Yes or no? Yes. When an animal has that urge, do you think an animal asks, wait, is this halal? Wait, let me stop a second. Is this halal? No, they don't. They don't care. They have the urge, they fulfill the urge. Urge, fulfillment. No space in between to ask, is this halal? There's a lot of human beings living just like that, right? Yes or no? I have the urge, I fulfill it. There's no question of, is this halal? I want to eat, I eat. I want to drink, I drink. I want intimacy, I take it. It's not a question of, is it halal? So this makes a human being get down to the level of an animal if they live in that way. And we have a lot of people who live in that way. In fact, it makes us lower than the animals. You know why? Because animals don't have a choice. Animals don't have the capacity to say, is this halal? Whereas we do. And so when we act in that way, we become lower than the animals. So fasting is training us to not be subservient to those lower desires, but to make those lower desires subservient to us, subservient to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, subservient to Allah. And then finally, Hajj. Hajj is about leaving behind your comfort. How many people have ever been on Hajj? Okay. Anyone who's been on Hajj knows that actually it's extremely different than Umrah. Because Umrah is something that you can finish in like 2 hours. You do tawaf and you do sa'i. Whereas Hajj is a whole different ballgame. Hajj is really about leaving behind your comfort. And you know when you see those packages and they say 5-star and all that kind of stuff? You know what? Those are before the Hajj or after the Hajj. But during the Hajj, there's no 5-star in Muzdalifah because you're not even sleeping on a bed. You're sleeping on the ground. There's no 5-star in Medina, in Mina, because you're sleeping in a tent. Hajj itself is about leaving behind your comfort, for sure. It is about sacrifice. It is about not being so attached to your comfortable bed and to your status symbols. Because you know what? Do you guys know what the Hujjaj are wearing? What are they wearing? The men? They're wearing 2 pieces of cloth. Can you have any brand names on those cloths? You can't have like a Mercedes or a Tommy Hilfiger at home. There's no way to have a status symbol. You can't even have thread on it. So the purpose of this is what? You letting go of those status symbols, letting go of those things that we're so attached to. No, I need people to know that I can afford Tommy Hilfiger. I need people to know that. I need to put myself above people because of that. We leave that behind. We leave behind our comfort. We leave behind our families. And you focus on your ultimate purpose. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us a prescription. Look at the 5 pillars. Allah has given us this prescription. Our problem is we don't really understand it and we don't really follow it. But if we did, then we would have everything we need to get through this life and fulfill that ultimate purpose of Ubudiyya. So inshallah, I'm going to pause there, stop there, and open it up for questions and reflections or whatever you guys want. First, I want to ask you not all to talk at once. Anyone want to start us out? Yes.
My question's a little bit more technical. You talked earlier about kind of submitting to your desires, your hawa, right? Is that shirk? So like, or is shirk reserved just for like the association of a deity with God? If I'm associating something like materialism or like any other concept with God, is that considered shirk or like minor shirk, or is that just like reserved for the other?
No. So his question is that, like, the concept of submitting to your desires. Is that like a form of shirk, like a minor form of shirk? We know shirk, okay, the word shirk means to associate a partner with God. Typically, when we think of shirk, we're thinking of shirk al-akbar, the greater shirk, which is to say that God is more than one, to say that God has a son, to say that God has any partner, to worship anything other than Him in terms of, praying or making God. This is major shirk. But there is also a minor shirk. There is also different levels of shirk. One of the levels of shirk that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran is a shirk in love, actually. Allah says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَتَّخِذُ مِنْ دُونِ اللَّهِ أَنْدَادًا يُحِبُّونَهُمْ كَحُبِّ اللَّهِ. So Allah says in this ayah that there are from among people, among men, those who take as rivals with Allah, andad, rivals with Allah, they love them as they should only love Allah. They love them as they should only love Allah. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. And those who believe are most intense, most overflowing in their love for Allah. So this ayah talks about a different type of, than we normally think of shirk. We think of shirk typically, again, the bigger shirk. But this is talking about love. And essentially this is talking about worship. Because when you love something, by definition you worship it. Because you become, this is the thing, when you, not necessarily, I'm gonna reword that. When you love something, that thing which you love has a power over you. And if whatever you love most in life becomes like a master for you, whatever you love most in life becomes your master. The people who love money most, their master is money. They'll do anything for it. The people who love status most, that's their master. The people who love that they, that they ride a certain type of car, or have a certain type of house, or have certain type of clothes, that becomes their master. And it's like, some people are, actually their master is fashion. Like, because fashion said so, you know what I'm saying? Like, why are you dressed like that? Because fashion said so, right? Like, a lot of us, we hear and we obey. like seriously, fashion commands, I hear and I obey. Shouldn't we stop and ask, what are we obeying exactly? And you guys, really, like when you step back and you observe, I'm a little older than y'all, so I've kind of seen the different fashion trends change drastically, like in the last 5 years, 7 years, like drastic. One example is jeans. Oh my God. Like, there's been a drastic shift in what is considered jeans, okay? Jeans used to be pants. Now, jeans are tights. And we still okay with that. We're all okay with that. The reason we're okay with that is because we've made fashion into a sort of master, right? Well, fashion says so. But we should be able to say, nah, actually, that's not okay. Just because fashion says that these are pants doesn't mean I have to believe it. Because these are, by every definition, tights. You feel me? You guys understand what I'm saying? Come on, they're not pants. They're just thick tights. So the point is that you guys see my point. That this wasn't always the case. I still remember the days when it was okay, they were flares. Okay, yeah, they were a little tight at the thigh and then they went out. And before that, there was like belts, whatever. But like in our lifetime, they've changed. This is what I mean. When fashion commands something and God commands something else, which one do I obey? This is a question of love. This is a question of, ultimately, it's a question of obedience. Make sense? When society commands that every person's supposed to drive a certain kind of car, a certain level, when society commands that you're supposed to have a certain size of house, when society commands you're supposed to, have certain brand name clothes, when society commands that you're supposed to make a certain amount of money, see, these are all commandments of society. Everybody's always sending commandments at you, by the way. But the question is, which ones are you obeying? Society is always commanding something. And Allah is also commanding something. But we have all these commands about money, about our degrees, about our houses, about our cars. And so when we have that, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we have the command of Allah that talks about riba, that talks about interest and usury. You feel me? And they're contradictory a lot of the time. Because in order to drive that type of car, you gotta have a certain interest, you know, like you gotta finance it. In order to have that size of house, you gotta have a huge mortgage. In order to get that degree, you gotta be in debt for the rest of your life. Okay? So the idea here is we're always faced with these choices. You guys understand what I'm saying? We're always faced with these choices. And ultimately, what do we obey? This is the question. And I would argue it comes back to love. What do we love most? Do we love our status symbols most? Do we love God most? Do we love that we would look beautiful to society most? Or do we love the beauty that God defines most? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a definition of beauty too. And it is in modesty. But society has its own definition, and it is the opposite of modesty. The question is, which one do we love more? And therefore, which one do we obey? Other questions?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your nice explanation and interpretation of Ibadah. But I just want to ask you something a little bit more deeper than that. And that when you said the Ibadah is coming back to Allah and this prayer, fasting, all these things are the means for that. But ultimately, doesn't it stand that the way we pray, the way we fast are not the true Ibadah, and Allah didn't mean that to be the Ibadah, but the real Ibadah is what you want, what you are expected to achieve through this. Because I may stand in the prayer and thinking that how I am going to do my shopping today, and or I am fasting and thinking that, well, it's good that I have some weight losing through this. So the act is I am doing all right, but not achieving it. So ultimately, where it stands is that if you do not get the inner part of it or the essence of it, then you are not getting the Ibadah in itself.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I began to talk with, is that a lot of us are missing the essence. We're missing the point in the ritual. And I talked about how, we have these arguments about moon sighting. We have these arguments about, meat and this and that, while at the same time we are yelling at each other. Our manners are gone, even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger teach us to have certain manners. But we'll throw that out the window and we'll argue about this side issue where there's difference of opinion. So I absolutely agree that we've lost the essence. When it comes to ibadah, the purpose of ibadah is for me to be a abd to Allah, for me to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be a slave to Allah and thereby free. The way to get to that, Allah has given us the prescription. So these are means, yes, they are means, and in and of themselves, yes, but it is an act in and of itself of ibadah as well. It is, when I pray, I hear and I obey. Allah told me to pray. When I wear hijab, I hear and I obey. Allah told me to wear hijab. When I fast, I hear and I obey. Allah told me to fast. When I treat my husband or my wife or my children or my parents well, I hear and I obey. Allah told me to do that. Therefore, all of these things that I do, and I mentioned even sleep, can be an act of ibadah because it is part of my servitude. Allah told me to do it, that's why I do it. When people ask, why do you wear hijab? Well, okay, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. I personally don't like to answer that question by just saying to be modest. Because, well, then there's the question of, well, who defines modesty? I think that it's modest to just, to wear just something over my chest and not cover my hair. So who defines modesty? So we have to bring it back to ibadah. We have to bring it back to who is the one defining all of these things. Who's giving the commands? Because, like we said, society has its own definition of modesty or how you should dress, and Allah has a different definition. The question is, who sets your definition? That is your master. That is worship. If my definition for everything is coming from society, is coming from television, it's coming from the media, then I've made that into a master. If it's coming from people, then I've made that into a master. So we have to really get to the heart of it. Why am I wearing hijab? Because it's part of my ubudiyyah. Because it is part of my servitude to God. God says to, and I hear and I obey. Just like God told me to fast, I hear and I obey. God told me to pray, I hear and I obey. To the best of our ability. Of course, none of us are perfect. But that's part of worship, is that when the master says, I hear and I obey. So this is I think it is an important point. And if I'm just doing a ritual, but my heart is actually worshiping something else, then I guess I have missed the point.
Yes. In the final analysis, it is the mental state that has to be corrected. What they about.
It does, absolutely. And I actually am going to share a very profound quote, a hikmah, of where really it summarizes this point. And what he says, the Shaykh, he says, why, oh my son, why do I see you standing and sitting and kneeling and in prostration, staying up late, tiring yourself, and your heart has not moved from its place, and you have not left your habits? This is our state to a large degree. We are involved in these acts externally, which are necessary. But our hearts are not changing. Our hearts are the same. So someone might be involved in the Islamic work for 15 years. They still treat their family in the same bad way. They still have a very bad temper. They still don't depend completely on Allah. There's no change inside. So it's like a person running on a treadmill. They're getting really tired. The gerbil wheel, right? You're getting really tired, but you're not moving anywhere. The heart is not moving. The essence, yes, is the movement of the heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We know from the words, we know from the Quran in the dua of Ibrahim alayhi salam, وَلَا تُخْزِنِي يَوْمَ يُبْعَثُونَ يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. Ibrahim alayhi salam is asking God, do not disgrace me on the day when we are brought back. The day when no money or children can help you except for the one who comes to Allah with a heart that's sound. So the heart is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to look at. And of course he looks, we're told Allah does not look at our exterior, but he looks at our deeds and our heart and our deeds. Any last questions? Okay. Oh, you have one?
I really appreciate that your explanation for the wisdom behind hardship and ibtila. And in my opinion, actually, I'd like to add to that we are seeking a solution for the trouble we're passing through, and as well we're seeking inner peace through that. Because we know that we have Allah for His wisdom created us in need.
Yes.
It's not because He would like to subhanahu wa ta'ala from He needs us, but we need Him. And so when we go back to Him at the time of hardship, we reclaim our self-satisfaction and inner peace, which is actually how every European Shadeed has roots, sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. And we need every while to go to a stronger entity than ours. So I would love to have this meaning that you presented alive in our mind, so we would not hate the bad times that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is taking us through, but would appreciate these bad times because we will go back to Him, so we'll free ourselves from our shackles in our hearts.
Absolutely. And that's exactly right. I mean, for those of you who couldn't hear in the back, the very, very profound point that's being made here is that if we understand, that within the hardship, that this is bringing us back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and also giving us peace internally. Because when we go back to Allah, when we worship Allah, when we pray, we are not doing Allah any favors. Y'all realize that, right? Allah doesn't need us. Allah does not need us. He is al-Ghani. He is completely free and rich of us. He is self-sufficient. We are the ones who need Allah. So it is a favor upon us that He brings us back to Him. Makes sense? And so it is that inner peace is for our own good, and it creates that freedom. Really, what happens when you go through hardship, that purification, we talked about tamhis, right? Purification, what that's doing is actually freeing you. And of course there's different levels of freedom as there is different levels of ubudiyah. The more free you are, the more that you are solely dependent on Allah and not, do not have these shackles around your heart. These shackles really come in different forms, but they are the idols, the things that we love as we should only love God, the things that we depend on as we should only depend on God, the things that we put our hope in as we should only put our hope in Allah. They're basically these, competitors that we have in our heart. Sometimes it takes hardships to break those, and in other words, breaking those false attachments. Yes?
You talked about, did you give us the blender example for explaining the concept of purpose?
The what example?
For purpose?
Uh-huh.
Like the blender example?
Yes.
I was wondering, if you make a bad blender, of course it's not going to work well. If you make a good one, it's going to work fine. So, and then comparing to that, to the purpose, how we can determine desires in terms of how we create. So how is that clear that we can be penalized or set for mistakes?
The difference is the blender doesn't have something very important called free will. The example of the blender is not an exact, of course it's different because the blender doesn't have a choice. The angels, for example, they don't have a choice. So they're not held accountable. God will only hold you accountable for what you had a choice about. You're not going to be held accountable for what city you were born in. He's not going to say all the people born in Chicago, they get to go to heaven. All the people born in Cali, they go to hell. Because it's not your choice. It's not in your control. You're not going to be held accountable for the color of your skin. You're not going to be held accountable for what language you speak in your country. Those things you will never be held accountable for because it wouldn't be fair, like he said. But you will be held accountable for whether you chose, with your free will, to act and dress a certain way, to whether or not you're going to pray, whether or not you're going to... Those things, because you have a choice in them. So the key difference between you and a blender is free will, is the free choice. That you have the choice to either follow your desires, if they are in contradiction to the law of God, or to follow God. These are all choices that we have. Make sense?
As a student, our daily lives revolve around our study.
Yes.
So how is it that we want to make sure that our study is
doesn't
an act
take
of
over?
behavior?
Okay, that's a very relevant question. He's asking about, as a student, it's really easy to get caught up in school, right? Because your life revolves around studying. And this actually goes back to the purpose of salah, for example, the purpose of prayer. You could be studying for the most important exam of your life, but when the time of prayer comes, you need to leave the studying and you need to refocus 5 times, at least. If you're not praying any sunnah prayers, 5 times at least. So Allah actually gives us the way. That's one example of how practically to do it. Another example is in the supplications. So dhikr, the fact that if you're filling your life, even when, in between studying, you're having time where you're remembering God, even as you're walking, there is a dua, a supplication for pretty much every action that you can do in life. If we look at the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, there is a supplication for everything. Before you eat, before you start eating, after you finish eating, before you start driving, when you arrive, when you leave the house, when you come back to the house, when you go into the masjid, when you leave the masjid, when you start studying, when you enter the bathroom, there's a dua. When you leave the bathroom, there's a dua. Even before intimacy, there's a dua. The idea here is that you can remember God standing, sitting, and on your side. So doing these practical things, like learning the dua, having a certain set of things that you say every day of God, every single day, make it part of your routine in the morning, before you sleep, after your prayers, reading Quran regularly. That's how you keep the heart from getting lost in the distractions and getting lost in the means. In the means. Because your study, is it the ultimate goal of your life to be an engineer or to be a doctor? No, it isn't. It is a means. And if it becomes your ultimate goal in life, maybe there's some people where it is, looking down. If it's your ultimate goal in life, then you've missed the point. You've missed the purpose of your creation. It isn't your ultimate goal in life to be a doctor. And it isn't your ultimate, sisters also, we always have to be reminded of this. It isn't our ultimate goal in life to get married. It really isn't. Even though everyone's going to tell you that it is. You know, it's like, why aren't you married yet? Why aren't you a complete human yet? You know, like you're walking around incomplete until you get married. And then you're still incomplete because you haven't had kids. The idea is that, yes, these are means. One of many. But it is not your ultimate purpose in life to get married. Shocker, I know, news flash. It isn't. Every auntie will tell you that it is. But it isn't. And similarly, you know, with your degree and so, but it's so hard. Sometimes we get lost in these things. But this is like getting lost in the car before you even turn it on. It's not going to take you anywhere because you're so in love with the leather seats. You know, you're like, wow, look at the steering wheel. This is an amazing steering wheel. And then you die in the car and you never went anywhere. Right? We are trying to get somewhere. These degrees that we have, this education, marriage, all of these things are just the car. But we get lost in it. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, inshallah we'll end there and we'll do the signing inshallah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إنه غفور رحيم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.